Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and I am excited today to be here with you going over a $100 tournament I recently won on PokerStars. This is actually the bigger 109. Every Sunday they have a few tournaments that they highlight in red, meaning that these tournaments have gigantic guarantees and they usually get very large fields. So this tournament, for example, had a $200,000 guarantee, which means it had to get at least 2,000 people. And it actually ended up getting 3,121 people. So very big prize pool. And obviously, it's great to win these type of tournaments, especially a higher buy-in one. First place was roughly $49,000, which is 500 buy-ins. So it's also nice to see that they're paying first place. I guess this is roughly 18% or something like that of the prize pool. I should also mention that before we get started in this, I have not reviewed any of these hands. I played this tournament around 3 weeks ago, and I have no clue what I did throughout this tournament. I could have played really poorly, or I could have played really great. I imagine I've been reviewing some of my other tournaments recently, and I've seen some mistakes creeping in. Usually, they're really minor things, but I see them looking back. Often it has to do with not seeing stack sizes properly or not accounting for my opponent's statistics properly. And I think that's because whenever I've been playing recently, I've been playing something like 20 tables at a time. And because of that, you just miss stuff. And if I see anything like that, I'll definitely point it out. But hopefully I end up playing pretty well. If I remember correctly, I end up sort of like running over the table once we got deep in the tournament. I actually recorded the final... Once there were 14 players left, I started recording live, so we won't have to go over that in Hold'em Manager. We can go over it in a video replayer. So that'll be pretty cool. I did not record audio whenever I was doing that. I was actually in Prague at the time with a bunch of friends, and I didn't feel like sitting up there and talking all night and waking everyone up because they all had to play tournaments the next day. So anyways, we'll go ahead and get right into it. I guess I should go ahead and list the statistics I have on people. So I guess we can just look at mine. That will be a good example since I have all of them filled out. If you see players with a bunch of dashes in theirs, that means that they do not have a big enough sample for those stats to be anywhere near relevant yet, so I just choose to not display them. Like, if a guy's continuation bet twice, his continuation bet percentage would be 100%, but that doesn't really give me a real picture, so I'd prefer to just have some sort of a set number for a lot of these numbers before I even display them. And you're going to find, unless a guy is a regular who I've played a lot with, I'm probably not going to have too many numbers on them. It's kind of interesting. It only says I have 5,000 hands here, though, which is obviously not right. Weird. Also weird, just looking at this, on the pop-up, it says I'm losing at 9 big blinds per 100. However, I've won 8 million chips. Interesting. I really don't pay too much attention to a lot of these generic numbers that are put up here, although I do pay attention to these. So the first number, V, is VPIP. And the second number is pre-flop raise. I'm playing roughly 25% of my hands and raising around 19% of them. I think those are pretty good, loose-ish, aggressive-ish numbers. I don't think you can get too much looser than this and maintain being profitable. I think you can certainly be much tighter than this and be profitable. I know a lot of very good online players play something like 14, 12 or something like that, and they turn a winner. So don't be fooled into thinking that you have to play loose-ish, aggressive-ish in order to win. So just be aware of that. I actually think I play tighter in live poker, which may sound a little bit crazy. But I think the reason for that is because I can often look and tell whenever a tight guy is raising, and I just do not give him action. Whereas online, it's much more difficult to actually see that. So I feel like live, totally off the top of my head, I probably play closer to 2017 or so. And that's mainly because I'm still raising a lot of hands from late position, but I'm making a few more folds whenever it becomes clear that someone either yet to act or someone who's already raised has something pretty good. The next number, ST, is steal percentage. I'm not going to roll over it because then it'll bring up this pop-up. I actually don't use these pop-ups very often at all, mainly because I just don't play enough online poker. I'm not oriented well enough with where everything is located. Obviously, that's not an excuse if you're going to be playing online poker, especially for a living. You definitely need to at least be aware of a lot of these other generic statistics. Anyway, steal percentage, that's how often you raise from the cutoff or the button when everyone folds around to you. So you see I'm raising 56% of hands, which is very wide. I should be getting 3-bet a lot. If you look around the table at the people who have steal percentages, it's all much lower. We have 17, 13, 15, 29, and mine's at 56. So I steal a lot, and I think stealing is very good, especially later in the tournament when you can somewhat push people around. Next number is fold big blind to steal. That's at 55%. This may be a little bit tight, actually. I feel like I need to work a little bit on defending in the big blind in my game in general. And I've been defending significantly wider over the last probably year or so, but I still think there's room for improvement. Like, for example, I do not really defend too often with stuff like King 3 offsuit when facing a middle position min raise, but I look at a lot of people who I perceive to be very good players, and some of them are. So what that tells me is I probably need to be doing that as well. Assuming they know what they're doing, which I assume they do. But anyways, I definitely think that even 55% is higher than most people are or 45% defending range is higher than most players. And also the number is skewed a bit because you're not always facing a min raise. Whenever you start facing a 3 big blind raise, it becomes much easier to fold out a lot of stuff. Next number is 3-bet at 10%. That's fairly high as well. Fold big blind to 3-bet's 55%. Seems reasonable to me. 4-bet percentage, fold to 4-bet percentage. Seems like I'm not folding to 4-bets very often. And I generally agree with that, especially from loose aggressive players. For a while, probably 2 or 3 years ago, there was a time where anytime I would raise and get 3-bet, I would just 4-bet every time. And that's because people were 3-betting so often with a wide range, but they were not defending well against 4-bets. And I don't think that that's necessarily what we're dealing with today, but I certainly think that most people who are 3-betting are not thinking about dealing with a 4-bet. All right, the next line, we have bet. This is continuation bet, flop, turn, and river. The turn and river numbers are always interesting because they should really be dependent on each other to some extent, meaning that if you are betting a low percentage on the turn, let me think about this. If you're betting the turn a lot, you should probably also be betting the river a lot. However, if you're betting small on the turn, you need to be betting way more hands on the river than if you're betting big on the turn. So I don't really read into these too much. I guess the main one I read into is flop continuation bet percentage. I think 87% is pretty good against generic weak opponents. I would probably make it a little bit lower against good opponents, maybe as low as 65% or so. Next line is fold to continuation bets. So 54%, 25%, 22%. I feel like maybe I'm calling down a little bit too much just looking at those. I feel like folding on the turn and the river only 25 and 22% of the time seems a little bit low. And then the last line is check raise, flop, turn, and river. I actually have been check raising more. If you guys have read my book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Volume 1, you know that back then, when I wrote that, a few years ago now, probably 4 years ago or so, I did not advocate check raising at all, period. And I've actually talked to a lot of very good poker players who also are perfectly fine never check raising. They literally never check raise with relatively deep stacks, like 40 big blind stacks or more. And that's because when you check raising is a very hard thing to balance. Anytime you're doing something very rarely, it's hard to balance. And that goes for check raising, leading into your opponent's 6-bet bluffing. I mean, all that stuff is very difficult, or 6-betting in general. All that stuff is really hard to balance. And for that reason, if you completely take it out of your game, you don't have to worry about balancing it. That means you also have to figure out how to play those hands by not taking those aggressive lines. But that's often easier to do and also makes those ranges just significantly stronger than if you're check raising, say, your best and your worst hands. So anyways, that's probably too much information about all of these stats that I have displayed. Some other stats you may want to look into are went to showdown percentage. You'll find that some players go to the showdown very often, meaning they're calling stations. These are the stats I use, but some other stats you may want to be aware of. Also, just aggression factor in general. These numbers on the bottom are sort of just a more robust way of me looking at aggression factor, but that I think it effectively measures how often people are betting compared to how often they're checking. And that's certainly relevant. If you know a guy is very passive and he's betting, then that should tell you something. And if you know he's very aggressive and he's betting, it should not tell you so much. I was actually at the poker table the other day, and I was listening to a small to mid-stakes online guy sort of being a fanboy to a really good high-stakes online guy. And the high-stakes online guy was telling the other guy that he's been paying attention recently to the percentage that people are 3-betting versus under-the-gun raisers. That specific stat. And the reason he said he was paying attention to that is because a lot of people have now started 3-betting early position raisers relentlessly, because probably 2 or 3 years ago, again, a lot of people started raising from early position with a very wide range, thinking that if I raise, my opponents are only going to play back when they have very premium hands. This is usually whenever you're dealing with 30 big blind stacks or so. Because, people don't want to 3-bet versus a very tight range whenever they're going to have to risk their stack, and they also don't want to really flat call too often because they're not getting great pot odds. So anyways, he said he's been paying attention to that stat, and he thinks it's been pretty useful. That being said, the online guy is somewhat blatantly crazy, so who knows what he is. Who knows if we should actually be taking too much, or putting too much stock in that. But that's a stat that I think I am going to add to my HUD just to see what happens there. Other general stats, I feel like these are mostly what you need to use. If you have these pop-ups, if we bring up mine, for example, you'll see that you can have stuff like steal from, I don't know, early positions. It's not really stealing. So let's say fold to steal, for example. So this is a relevant stat. This is how often people are folding versus late position raises. Some people fold more, some people fold less. Anyways, there's just a ton of stats. But even then, you see that it's not like I have huge samples on any of these, over 5,000 hand samples. So you're going to find that the main stats you're going to want to pay attention to are just the first 3 lines I have here. Those are going to be the ones that will populate over a somewhat short sample. Let's go ahead and get into it. So this guy raises. Again, I'm going to assume I don't know anything about these players. Also, it's worth mentioning that the heads up displays stats. Even though it says I have 8 hands on this guy, this is only the 3rd hand of the tournament. So what this tells me is that these stats are the total amount of hands I have on players, not the hand up until this point. So I know this guy's playing 13-13 over 8 hands, which means he's raised 1 hand. But that doesn't really tell me anything. So just be aware of that. Even if I had, let's say I had 100 hands on this guy, I would also not read into that at this point for sake of analysis, because that means that those 100 hands probably came from this session. So I would not have known those stats yet. Interestingly enough, we have 1 hand on this guy, so this just shows that the heads-up display is working right. This guy raised 1 out of 8 hands. This is it. And he got 3-bet, and he folded to the 3-bet because he 4-bet, or he did not 4-bet this time. So we know that because he has a 0% 4-bet. It doesn't really tell us anything, but it's always nice to see your heads-up display working. And I think 3-betting with pocket 10s there is perfectly fine. I'm not really doing any other play early in the tournament. I'm fine with calling with hands like pocket 7s on the button. I could also 3-bet. With hands that are middle pairs, and I'm going to be able to see a cheap flop almost for sure, I'm perfectly happy to call and see what develops, especially if I don't know too much about my opponent. Whenever I'm very deep stacked, I feel like I'm a little bit less inclined to 3-bet than some players. And I think that is because I'm fine playing after the flop. I've worked really hard on getting good at playing after the flop. I did that by playing a lot of cash games with roughly 100 and 150 big blind stacks. And I think it's helped my game significantly because it makes me aware that I don't have to play big pots anytime I want to play a hand. And that 3-betting, while it may be profitable, leads to a huge amount of variance. And I don't really want to take on that variance. So this guy, continuation bets. I'm certainly going to call this flop. This is a scenario where I could, of course, be beat, but if I call, my opponent's probably going to give up whenever he doesn't have anything. He continues betting on the turn. Now that I have a gut shot, and my opponent, of course, could still be bluffing, I think I'm just going to call again. Well, that's a good river. He checks. So if I miss this river, I would just check behind. And now that I got there on the river, I am definitely going to value bet. And I think right here I need to ask myself, how much will my opponent call if he has a jack? I don't think he's going to call with much worse than that ever. So I think he'll probably call 330 with a jack or something like that. I like to go big, though. This is a leveling play that I'll occasionally do. Specifically, whenever we're very deep stacked, because notice we started with 150 big blinds. Quite often, you'll find scenarios where you can look really bluffy. And this is actually a pretty good one to do that, because notice the obvious flush draw missed, right? So since the obvious flush draw missed, I could easily have that. I could also have a random 6 or a random 3 or a random jack or something like pocket 8s that I'm deciding to turn into a bluff. So this is an interesting play. I don't really know if I don't think it's gonna work this time too often, just looking at this scenario. But I think that this is something I would want to do, especially if I have any sort of aggressive dynamic with my opponents. One other benefit to this play is that it may allow me to make a similar bet later in the future and have much less fold equity, because my opponent will have seen this line and he'll think, oh, this guy just does this a lot, and then therefore he'll look it up much wider later. Really, you have to recognize whatever you do early in a tournament, as long as you're not just giving your stack away, isn't too incredibly relevant. Like say I would have won 300 chips 50% of the time, or 760 chips, I don't know, 20% of the time. So slightly less than half, given that I'm betting twice as much. So they're going to be roughly the same equity. Maybe this one's slightly less profitable on this individual hand, but it definitely sets up a dynamic that I can hopefully abuse in the future. Anyways, the opponent does call, which is great. And I win. And he actually had a set of jacks, so that's pretty unlucky. I guess that's worth mentioning also, that if my opponent actually does have a hand better than one jack, he's probably going to call any size will bet. Although you have to recognize, whenever I blast the river, I'm going to be polarized one way or the other. So there's not a whole lot of a difference between ace jack and pocket jacks right here. Although a lot of people will call with both of them somewhat blindly, which I don't think is necessarily a bad play. All right, so I raise, and I think this guy's a regular. I don't seem to have any hands on him, but I think this guy's a regular. Anyway, so I raise. He makes it 140. This is another spot where I'm just going to call. I'm going to try to flop well. And I just check fold the flop. I think this is a little bit too weak. I think I should probably call. But again, that leads to really dicey spots. So I've also been thinking more about just making plays less concerned about future streets. And I know I've discussed you always want to pay attention to future streets. However, I have to ask myself, am I good here 25% of the time? And will I be able to get to the showdown at least sometimes? And I think the answer to that is definitely yes. So I should probably call here and see what develops. But especially against good players, you're going to find that what develops is you're facing a lot of bets. And you don't really want to face a lot of bets with a marginal underpair. So I'm okay with the fold, but I think it's probably just a little bit too tight. So I could three bet this if I felt like it, but I'm certainly not going to do it in this scenario, given that I have very few hands on this guy, and I don't know anything about him. King 9 offsuit, I'll probably just fold this if they fold to me. I'm a pretty big fan of folding the low jack seat and earlier with hands like King 9 offsuit. I think raising is okay. I definitely don't have a problem with that. Looking around the table, if everyone is pretty tight, I would definitely raise this. But given that I have two somewhat active players, again, we have no samples, but given I have two, even if I have a bunch of random guys, I'm definitely going to fold. If I have some very tight players, though, I'll consider raising. All right, we get a new table. So looking around this table, you see that we have at least some number of hands on these players at this point. We're starting to get a realistic idea of this Daniel player. Notice that he's playing. You can tell a lot about a player by the first two stats. He's playing a decent amount of hands, but he's limping almost all of them. He's pre-flop raising only 4% of hands. So what that tells me is when this guy raises pre-flop, I don't want to be messing around. However, he is going to be calling a lot of raises, and he's going to be limping some. So be aware of that. I think this Fatima is a Poker Stars Pro or something like that. And I don't really know anyone else. All right, facing a min raise, I will happily call with 9-7 suited from the small blind and just try to flop well. If it checks through on the flop, I'll certainly bet the turn. When this guy bets the flop, I'm probably just going to fold. I think I could also check raise. I don't think that would be too incredibly out of line. I wish the board was more like Queen 6-5. I would be much happier check raising there, because the pre-flop raising range of the cutoff is going to contain a lot of aces, but not necessarily a lot of queens. So I'm going to have a lot more fold equity on queen 6-5 than ace 6-5. So this is a spot where I would consider check raising. And I'm primarily check raising with hands that are very good, like sets, and also sets, 2 pairs, and also premium draws, which are very strong, and also sporadic draws that are not quite good enough to call with. If the flop was ace 6-5 with the ace of hearts, I'd probably go ahead and check raise it. I wouldn't be very happy about it. This guy's bet sizing may be a little bit telling. Notice he's betting 150 into 180. That's a pretty big bet. And that would generally sway me into not making that play. If he made a more standard bet of around 100, I would be much more inclined to go for it. But I'm just going to fold this time. But that's a good example of a hand that I think is pretty easy to check raise, given I am check raising a lot of my best hands. So again, that's me just trying to make it balanced. I want to be doing it with the very good hands and hands that are not quite good enough to call with. Ace-X offsuit from pretty much the low jack or better. Again, it's very similar to King-9 offsuit. I'm just folding these. From early position, I'm definitely folding them. If I was in the low jack seat, I would consider raising if everyone was tight yet to act. I actually got myself in trouble, 2 days ago. I'm actually at the PCA right now in the Bahamas, and I raised ace-3 offsuit from, I think, middle position just because I had a bunch of tight guys behind me, and then it went raised 3-bet and 4-bet behind me. So I'm like, oh, well, that's what I get. Maximum punishment. All right, small blind raises to the minimum. I'm going to call and take a flop in position. This is something I will do very, very often. Whenever I'm facing a min raise from the small blind, I'm calling with a lot from the big blind. A lot. So definitely calling jack-8 suited. Not a very good flop for me. I'm just going to fold. I think I could also consider raising, but it's really hard to represent anything on that board. So I like to fold the queen 3 offsuit from the button. I think this is perfectly fine. I think I could also raise it. Once antes come into play, I would almost certainly raise this. But with no antes, we can just get out of the way. That sort of goes back to what I was discussing earlier, that you don't have to get too far out of line, especially early in a tournament whenever you're not really playing to win too much. And whenever you're trying to steal 60 chips and blinds, it's just not that big of a deal. And also, if you're playing 20 other tables, you probably have a lot of other hands going on that you probably want to pay attention to. So you should probably spend the focus on that. I mean, again, I know that sounds sort of like a cop-out saying that you're going to maybe sacrifice a bit of equity to play more tables, but you have to think about it like this. Say I know I could turn, 50% return on investment if I play 20 tables, or I could turn 100% return on investment if I played 4 tables. Unless those 4 tables are really high stakes, which means I'm not going to have as high of a return on investment anyways, it's going to make way more sense to play 20 tables. Because, if I have 100% ROI and I'm playing 4 tables, that's roughly 400%. But if I have 20 tables and I have 50% ROI, that's 1,000%. So I'd be making twice as much money, even by cutting my win rate in half. So that's why I opt to play a lot of tables, because I'm playing online poker to win the most money possible, not to necessarily spend a lot of time focusing on each and every decision. I think if you are just starting to learn poker, or if even you are a smaller middle stakes guy who's making a living at it, your primary goal should be to get to the high stakes games as fast as possible with the skills required to beat those games. And I think a lot of players get confused by that, and they think that, I need to get there as fast as possible, so I need to play a lot of tables so I have the bankroll to play. But just because you have the bankroll to play does not mean that you actually have the skills to play. In order to develop those skills, you have to play fewer tables so that you can actually focus on all of the hands. And also, you need to spend a lot of time studying. So you're going to find that whenever you are up and coming, a lot of your time needs to be spent not maximizing dollars per hour, but instead getting really good at poker so that you can move to the higher stakes games and then actually make a really good hourly rate. All right, anyways, sorry for that tangent. Here I have pocket twos, I raise. I like the min raise. I think 1.25 is or 2.5 big blinds is probably my standard. But 100's fine, whatever. Very tight guy. Min re-raises. This Fatima calls. I'm definitely going to call and try to get a set. And I do get a set. That's good. He goes check, check, check. That's super unfortunate. I was definitely check raising the flop. So this is another spot where I think check raising would be great. Especially against a guy who's not playing very many hands. It's sort of interesting to note that if I'm really not check raising against good players here very often because it's really hard for me to actually have too many bluffs. So that means I'm going to be primarily tilted towards value. I mean, what are my bluffs I could even have here? Like Jack 10, that's it. And so I guess if I'm check raising King, Queen, Queens, twos. I mean, I probably don't even have queens. Yeah, I guess I could have queens. Queens, twos, and Jack 10, that's close to balanced, I guess, but doesn't seem like it to me. Fatima pots the turn. Well, I'm sure not folding. I like calling here. I definitely don't want to raise because if I raise, I think that will allow Fatima the opportunity to get off the hook. And the last thing I want to do is let her fold ace queen or king jack or something like that, destroying nearly dead. Also, the other player may come along as well, which would be fantastic. And he does. So I'm trying to figure out what the range is of this guy on the button. So he min 3-bet me, which automatically makes it very difficult for him to be a very good player because very good players simply are not making that play. So that means that a lot of my rational thoughts do not apply to this guy. On the flop, he checks through, so he probably had either a king or queen, given that he's now calling the turn bet. So I think he probably has something like king jack, king 10, ace king, ace queen, queen jack, queen 10. Maybe jacks, maybe 10s. So that's what I think this guy has, and Fatima probably has. I mean, again, I don't know if she's actually good at poker or not. PokerStars has a lot of these sports figures they're now putting on their site because I guess that's what the general public likes. And for that reason, I don't know if she's actually good at poker. She's probably fine. I mean, if she's playing the bigger 109, I mean, she at least has some money to play. Obviously, if she's a sports star, she's probably rich. So, anyways, when she bets 475, I don't really think this is going to be Jack 10 that often. So for that reason, I think I effectively have the nuts here. And the only cards I'm scared of on the river are a Jack or 10. Beyond that, I'm happy calling on any river. She shoves the river. I have to ask if I should call or raise. And I think I should call here because if I call here, I think this buff guy will actually call with a king some percentage of the time, which would be fantastic. But if I raise, I think he's going to fold that every time. He may even make a bad call with ace queen or queen jack if I call. That would be a terrible call, but some people will make it because they just play bad. Whenever a guy's min-raising raising you pre-flop, you need to, again, revert back to how you thought when you first started playing poker. So anyways, I think I probably should have called this river. I don't think this buff player is going to call off with worse than maybe pocket aces. Maybe ace king. I think he's probably going to call off with ace king. So I think this was a bad shove by me. I think I should have called. And Fatima had king queen, so she just sort of got set up. I actually don't like her turn pot because whenever she pots the turn, it looks like she has something good, right? I don't think she's folding to a shove. I guess that's worth mentioning. Whenever she pots the turn, I don't think she's folding to a shove every time or anything like that. I don't think she has a lot of marginal made hands, although she certainly could have hands that are pretty good, like king jack. I think she would still call off with king jack if I shoved. So that there is some merit in just raising here and getting all the money in. But I think that I'm just going to be much more inclined to call to keep this other buff player in the pot when he's drawing to 4 outs or less. Well, I guess if he has jacks, he has 6 outs. So anyways, that's why I called the turn. I think I should have called the river as well. Very rarely do you want to call on the river with the effective nuts, but that's one of those spots where I think it makes sense. Facing a limp and a raise, I'm definitely going to fold. A limp raise and a call. I'm definitely going to fold this ace-8 offsuit. There's no real point in playing that hand. Especially out of position. All right, from Nasty Minder, he min raises the cutoff. I'm fine calling this. He has 33 big blinds. Whatever. We have a good hand in position that's going to flop well. Small blind 3-bets, and that's very concerning whenever you see the small blind 3-betting fairly small. Given that we are 60 big blind deep, I'm getting 3-1 immediately. I'll probably take a flop in position. I don't love this. I think folding would be okay, but these are spots I generally like to put myself in where I can lose a little or win a lot. And in this scenario, I simply lose a little because I don't flop anything. Whenever I miss the flop, I'm going to be folding pretty much every time. I hate that he bet 250 because it lets my opponent bluff very cheaply. But he really should be betting very small on a lot of these flops, on flops that are very dry. If the board had an 8 or a 7 and he bet 250, I'm pretty much calling every time, even if it's something like, I mean, I'm trying to think, ace, king, 7, maybe I would fold. So I guess I'm looking at, if it's ace 7-3, I'm definitely calling. If it's king 7-3, I'm definitely calling. If it's queen jack 7, I'd probably fold. I guess I'd fold if there are 2 Broadway cards on the board. So jack 10-7, I'd probably fold as well. Whenever I miss, though, I think folding and getting out of the way is perfectly fine. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I will be back with part 2.